A Sunday in the 60s, just like you were there. The Westclock's alarm clock pierced the pre-dawn silence at exactly 5:30 a.m., its metallic ring echoing through the modest two-story house on Elm Street. George Whitman's calloused hand slapped the button with practiced precision, the same movement he'd made every weekday for the past 17 years. Outside Millfield, Ohio lay wrapped in the grey blanket of early March, frost still clinging to the windows of the Chevrolet Impala parked in the narrow driveway. George rolled out of bed, his joints protesting with the familiar ache of a 42-year-old factory worker. The hardwood floors creaked under his weight as he padded to the bathroom, where he splashed cold water on his face and studied his reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. Brown hair receding at the temples, lines deepening around his blue eyes, stubble that would be gone in 3 minutes with his safety razor. The face of Middle America, unremarkable and proud of it. Downstairs, the kitchen was already alive with the sounds and smells of morning. Margaret Whitman, her auburn hair pinned back in rollers she'd wear until after breakfast, stood at the Frigidaire stove flipping strips of Oscar Mayer bacon in the cast-iron skillet her mother had given her as a wedding gift. The coffee, Maxwell House, always Maxwell House, percolated in the aluminum pot, its rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. "Morning, honey," she said without turning around, cracking 3 eggs into the bacon grease with the fluid motion of nearly 2 decades of practice. "Breakfast'll be ready in 5 minutes." George grunted his acknowledgement, pulling on his blue flannel workshirt and lacing up his steel-toed boots. The routine was sacred, unchanging: shower, dress, breakfast, newspaper, work. It was the rhythm that had built America, that had bought this house, that had put food on the table and clothes on their backs. The Zenith radio on the kitchen counter crackled to life as George twisted the dial. WMNI, Millfield's local station, was playing Yesterday by those Beatles boys, music that made him shake his head but that Margaret seemed to enjoy. The morning DJ's voice cut through the melody with practiced cheerfulness. "Good morning, Millfield. It's Tuesday, March 9th, 1965, and it's a brisk 34 degrees under cloudy skies. Traffic's moving smooth on Route 23, and the high today should reach a pleasant 52 degrees. Now here's Herman's Hermits with Mrs. Brown. You've got a lovely daughter." Margaret set the plate before him. 2 eggs over easy, 4 strips of bacon, 2 pieces of Wonder Bread toast with Parquet margarine, and a glass of Minute Maid orange juice. The same breakfast he'd eaten for 17 years, served on the same Corelle dinnerware they'd received as wedding gifts, accompanied by the same cup of coffee in the floral china mug that had somehow survived Brian's childhood mishaps. The Millfield Daily Herald lay folded beside his plate, delivered by Tommy Henderson, the Peterson boy who'd taken over the route when his older brother went off to Vietnam. George unfolded it with the satisfaction of a man who still believed in the ritual of morning news, real news printed on real paper, not the television nonsense that was taking over everything. Then he saw the headline, and the coffee mug stopped halfway to his lips. "Bloody Sunday. Police attack civil rights marchers in Selma, Alabama." The black and white photographs hit him like a physical blow. Bodies sprawled on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Men and women, some in their Sunday best, lying motionless on the pavement, while police officers in riot gear stood over them with clubs raised. Tear gas clouds obscuring the faces of people who looked ordinary. People who looked like they could live in Millfield, who could work at the GM plant, who could sit in the pew behind him at First Presbyterian. George's jaw tightened. He'd seen protests before, workers' strikes, civil rights demonstrations on the television news, but always at a comfortable distance, always as something that happened to other people in other places. This was different. The brutality in these photographs was undeniable, immediate, obscene. "Terrible thing," Margaret said quietly, refilling his coffee cup. She'd been reading over his shoulder, something that usually annoyed him, but that he barely noticed now. Those poor people were just trying to vote. George grunted, turning the page to the sports section. The Cincinnati Reds were looking good for the coming season. Spring training was underway in Florida. Normal things, safe things, things that made sense in a world where a man could understand the rules. But he couldn't concentrate on batting averages. The images from the front page burned in his mind, like after images from a flashbulb. He found himself turning back, studying the faces of the protesters, trying to understand What could drive ordinary people to walk into that kind of violence? Heavy footsteps on the stairs announced Brian's arrival. At 16, their son seemed to grow an inch every month, all gangly limbs and rebellious hair that no amount of Brel cream could tame. He wore his hair longer than George liked, not Beatles long, but getting there. And his jeans were what Margaret diplomatically called snug. "Morning, Mom, Dad." Brian slumped into his chair and immediately reached for the newspaper. "After you eat," Margaret said automatically, setting a plate in front of him. "You know the rules." But Brian was already scanning the headlines, his young face growing pale, and then flushed as he read. His breakfast sat untouched, eggs growing cold, bacon congealing in its grease. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "Language," George snapped automatically. "Look at this, Dad. Look what they did to these people. They were just walking across a bridge, and the police—" Brian's voice cracked with adolescent fury and bewilderment. "How is this America?" George felt a familiar knot of irritation in his chest. At 16, everything was black and white to Brian. Right and wrong, good and evil, with no understanding of how complicated the world really was. No appreciation for the delicate balance that kept society functioning, kept food on the table and roofs over heads. "The world's a complicated place, son," he said, folding the paper and checking his watch. "Things aren't always what they seem in the newspapers." "Complicated," Brian's voice rose. "Dad, they beat the hell out of people who were trying to vote. How is that complicated?" "Brian," Margaret warned, but her voice lacked its usual authority. George stood, draining his coffee cup and reaching for his lunch pail. Inside, Margaret had packed his usual, 2 ham and cheese sandwiches on white bread, an apple, and a thermos of coffee. The same lunch he'd carried to the plant for 17 years, the anchor that kept him grounded in a world that seemed to spin faster every day. "I'm late," he said, avoiding his son's eyes. "We'll talk about this tonight." But as he walked to the car, George could hear Brian's voice through the kitchen window, animated and passionate as he read passages from the newspaper aloud to his mother. There was something in that young voice, not just anger, but something else. Something that reminded George uncomfortably of his own father, Patrick Whitman, whose voice had carried that same tone when he talked about workers' rights and union organizing back in the 30s. The General Motors assembly plant sprawled across 40 acres on the south side of Millfield, its smokestacks reaching toward the grey sky like fingers grasping for something just out of reach. George had walked through those gates every weekday for 17 years, first as a young man eager to prove himself, now as a veteran worker who knew every sound the machinery made, every rhythm of the production line. He parked the Impala in his usual spot, 3rd row, 4th space from the left, and walked toward the employee entrance. The morning shift was arriving. Men in work clothes carrying lunch pails and thermoses, their faces bearing the stoic expression of people who understood that dignity came from honest work, from showing up every day and doing your job without complaint. "Morning, George." Tom Morrison fell into step beside him, lighting a Marlboro with a silver Zippo that caught the weak morning sun. Tom lived 3 houses down from the Whitmans on Elm Street, worked the same shift, and had opinions on everything from the Cincinnati Reds to the state of the world. "Tom," George nodded, pulling out his own pack of Lucky Strikes. The ritual of the morning smoke was as important as the coffee, a moment to transition from home to work, from husband and father to laborer and provider. "You see the paper this morning?" Tom exhaled a stream of smoke into the cold air. "All this business down in Alabama, bunch of outside agitators stirring up trouble, if you ask me." George said nothing, focusing on the familiar weight of his lunch pail, the comfortable routine of punching his time card. But Tom wasn't finished. "Mark my words, George, this civil rights business is going to tear this country apart. You got people who lived their whole lives one way, and now suddenly everyone's supposed to change overnight? It's not natural. It's not American." They reached their stations on the line, George installing door handles, Tom mounting rearview mirrors 2 positions down. The conveyor belt started with its familiar mechanical hum, and the first Chevelle body rolled toward them, white primer gleaming under the fluorescent lights. For the next 4 hours, George lost himself in the rhythm of the work. Install handle, check alignment, tighten screws, move to next car. It was meditative in its repetition, requiring just enough concentration to keep the mind occupied, but not so much that a man couldn't think. But today, His thoughts kept drifting back to the newspaper photographs. The face of a young black woman, maybe Brian's age, lying unconscious on the bridge. The expression of determination on the marchers' faces just before the police charged. The way the tear gas had obscured everything, turning human beings into shadows. At lunch break, the men gathered in the break room, opening their lunch pails and thermoses, while the radio played country music from WBNS Columbus. The conversation inevitably turned to Selma. "I'll tell you what," said Frank Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who'd worked the line for 23 years. "In the old country, we knew what police were for. Keep the peace, protect the people. This," he shook his head, biting into a kielbasa sandwich his wife had made, "this is something else. Different times, Frank," Tom Morrison countered. "These aren't peaceful protesters. These are revolutionaries. Communists, most likely. You let them get away with this kind of disruption. Where does it end?" George listened without contributing, methodically eating his ham and cheese while the argument escalated around him. Part of him agreed with Tom. Society needed order, rules, respect for authority. But another part, a part he'd tried to bury for years, remembered his father's stories about the sit-down strikes of the 30s, about workers standing up to company thugs and private police. "What do you think, George?" Frank asked. "You've been quiet." All eyes turned to him. George chewed slowly, buying time, trying to find words for feelings he couldn't quite name. "I think," he said finally, "that it's a damn shame when American citizens get their heads cracked for trying to exercise their constitutional rights." The break room fell silent. Tom Morrison's face darkened. "Constitutional rights?" he repeated. "George, these people are breaking the law. They don't have permits for these marches. They're disturbing the peace. So did the Boston Tea Party," George heard himself saying. "So did the workers who formed this union." He was as surprised by his words as everyone else. Where had that come from? He could see the confusion in Tom's eyes, the approval in Frank's nod, the way the other men were reassessing him, trying to figure out if George Whitman had suddenly become some kind of radical. The whistle blew, ending the lunch break before anyone could respond. As they walked back to their stations, Tom caught George's arm. "Careful, George," he said quietly. "That kind of talk can get a man in trouble. You've got a good job here, a family to think about. Don't let outside agitators fill your head with ideas that could hurt the people you love." For the rest of the shift, George worked in silence, his hands moving automatically while his mind churned. Tom was right about one thing. He did have a family to think about. A mortgage to pay, a son to put through college, a wife who deserved security and stability. Revolutionary ideas were luxuries he couldn't afford. But as he punched out at the end of the day, George found himself thinking about that young woman on the bridge, unconscious but still clutching a small American flag in her hand. George was washing his hands in the kitchen sink when the telephone rang. It was an old black Bakelite model mounted on the wall between the refrigerator and the bread box, its cord stretched and curled from years of Margaret pacing while she talked to her sister or the other wives in the neighborhood. "I'll get it," Margaret called from the living room, but George was closer. He dried his hands on the dish towel and lifted the heavy receiver. "Whitman residence." "Mr. Whitman, this is Eleanor Patterson from Millfield High School. I'm the vice principal." George's stomach dropped. Calls from the school were never good news. Broken windows, classroom disruptions, fights in the hallway. At 16, Brian was supposed to be past that stage, focused on grades and college applications, not whatever teenage rebellion had apparently caught up with him. "What's he done now?" George asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Well, that's what I need to discuss with you." Brian was found distributing unauthorized materials on school grounds during lunch period today. Specifically, flyers about civil rights demonstrations and voter registration drives. When we confiscated them, we also found literature about the situation in Selma, Alabama. George closed his eyes, leaning against the kitchen counter. In the background, he could hear the television in the living room. Walter Cronkite's measured voice delivering the evening news, the same authoritative tone that had guided America through Kennedy's assassination, the growing situation in Vietnam, and now this civil rights business that seemed to be tearing the country apart. "I see," he said, though he didn't see at all. Where would Brian get such materials? How had a kid from Millfield, Ohio, gotten involved in something happening 800 miles away? "There's more, Mr. Whitman. When we spoke with Brian about it, He expressed a desire to travel to Alabama to participate in what he called the movement. He seems to believe that the events in Selma represent some kind of calling, I suppose you'd say. The kitchen seemed to tilt around George. His son, his 16-year-old son, who still left his dirty clothes on the bedroom floor and forgot to take out the trash, wanted to travel to Alabama to march with protesters. To put himself in harm's way for people he'd never met, causes he barely understood. Mrs. Patterson, I can assure you that Brian will not be traveling anywhere, and there will be no more flyers, no more materials. I'll handle this. I hope so, Mr. Whitman. Brian's a good student, but this kind of activity, well, it reflects poorly on the school and on the family. I trust you understand. After he hung up, George stood in the kitchen for a long moment, listening to the familiar sounds of his home. Margaret's footsteps in the living room as she folded laundry, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a neighbor starting his car in the driveway next door. Normal sounds, safe sounds. The soundtrack of a life he'd worked 17 years to build. "Who was that, honey?" Margaret called. "School, we need to talk to Brian." When Margaret appeared in the doorway, George could see in her face that she already knew. Wives always knew. There was something in her expression, not surprise exactly, but a kind of resignation, as if she'd been expecting this call. "He's upstairs doing homework," she said quietly. "George, before you—" "Brian!" George's voice boomed through the house. "Get down here, now!" The footsteps on the stairs were slow, reluctant. Brian appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing dungarees and a white t-shirt, his hair freshly combed, but already rebellious. At 16, he was almost as tall as his father, but there was still something fragile about him, something that reminded George of the little boy who used to fall asleep in his lap during Sunday evening radio programs. "Sit down," George said, pointing to one of the kitchen chairs. Brian sat, his hands folded on the Formica tabletop, his eyes fixed on the salt and pepper shakers Margaret had bought at Woolworths the year they were married. Ceramic chickens, cheerful and domestic, representing everything stable about their life together. "Mrs. Patterson called. Want to explain to me what you were doing with civil rights flyers at school?" Brian's jaw tightened. So much like his father's, Margaret thought, watching from the doorway. Trying to educate people, trying to help them understand what's happening in this country. "Educate?" George's voice rose. "You're 16 years old, Brian. You don't educate anybody about anything. You go to school, you do your homework, you prepare for college. You don't involve yourself in politics, you don't understand." "I understand plenty." Brian looked up, his blue eyes flashing with anger and conviction. "I understand that people are being beaten for trying to vote. I understand that while we sit in this kitchen eating dinner and complaining about the weather, there are families in Alabama who can't even use the same water fountains as white people. That's not your problem." The words came out harder than George had intended, and he saw Brian flinch as if he'd been slapped. In the silence that followed, Margaret stepped into the kitchen, her hands twisted in the dish towel she'd been carrying. "Maybe it should be," she said quietly. Both men turned to look at her. Margaret Whitman, who had spent 18 years keeping peace in this house, who had learned to mediate between her husband's pragmatism and her son's idealism, who had perfected the art of saying nothing rather than saying the wrong thing. "Margaret," George warned. "No, George. I've been thinking about this all day, ever since I saw those pictures in the paper. That could be any of us. Those people lying on that bridge, they have jobs, families, children. They're just like us, except they can't vote. They can't eat at lunch counters. They can't send their children to decent schools." "That's not how the world works," George said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You can't just change society overnight. There are procedures, laws, proper channels." "The proper channels haven't worked for 100 years, Brian interrupted. "Dad, these people have been waiting since the Civil War ended. How long are they supposed to wait?" George looked from his wife to his son, feeling something shifting beneath his feet like sand at the ocean's edge. These were the two people he loved most in the world, the reasons he got up every morning and went to the plant, the motivations for every decision he'd made since the day he'd graduated high school and started working to support a family, and they were looking at him like strangers. "You are not going to Alabama," he said finally. "That's final. And there will be no more flyers, no more political activities at school. You're a student, not an activist." Brian's face hardened. "Fine, but you can't stop me from thinking." You can't stop me from caring. I can stop you from throwing your life away on causes that don't concern you. Don't concern me. Brian stood up, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Dad, when people are being brutalized for the color of their skin, it concerns every decent person in America. It concerns anyone who believes in justice, inequality, and the Constitution you keep talking about. Don't lecture me about the Constitution, young man. I fought in a war to defend this country. You fought in a war to defend freedom. So how can you stand there and tell me that freedom doesn't apply to everyone? The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the clock above the sink and the distant murmur of the television in the living room. George stared at his son, seeing not the rebellious teenager he'd expected, but something else. A young man grappling with moral questions that George himself wasn't sure how to answer. "Go to your room," he said quietly. "We'll discuss this tomorrow." Brian nodded, but as he reached the doorway, he turned back. "Dad, I found some of Grandpa Patrick's things in the attic. His journals from the 30s, when he was organizing the union at the old steel plant. You should read them sometime. I think you'd understand what I'm feeling." After Brian left, George and Margaret stood in the kitchen, the weight of the conversation settling between them like dust after an explosion. Outside, Elm Street looked the same as always. Modest houses with neat lawns, cars parked in driveways, porch lights beginning to flicker on as evening deepened. But inside the Whitman house, something had changed. The comfortable certainties of 17 years of marriage, of raising a family, of building a life based on hard work and traditional values, all of it suddenly felt less solid, less permanent. "He's not wrong, you know," Margaret said softly, hanging the dish towel on its hook beside the sink. George didn't answer. He walked to the window and looked out at their neighborhood, at Tom Morrison's house 3 doors down, at the American flag that hung from the Petersons' front porch, at the normal, predictable world he'd worked so hard to create and maintain. Somewhere in Alabama, people were planning another march. Somewhere in his own house, his son was reading his grandfather's journals and dreaming of justice and equality. And somewhere deep in his own heart, George Whitman was beginning to question everything he thought he knew about right and wrong, about duty and courage, about what it really meant to be an American. The next evening, George was in the garage working on the Impala's carburetor when he heard footsteps on the gravel driveway. Through the open door, he saw Tom Morrison approaching with 2 bottles of Budweiser and the purposeful stride of a man with something important to discuss. "Evening, George." Tom held up the beers. "Thought you might be ready for one of these." George wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag and accepted the bottle. Tom had brought a church key, and they opened their beers with the practiced ritual of working men everywhere. The sharp hiss of escaping carbonation, the satisfying pop of the metal caps hitting the concrete floor. "Heard there was some excitement at the high school yesterday," Tom said, settling onto an overturned milk crate that George used as a makeshift stool. Young Brian getting involved in politics. Word traveled fast in a town like Millfield. George should have expected this conversation, should have prepared for it. Tom Morrison had opinions about everything, and he wasn't shy about sharing them. "Kids these days," George said noncommittally, focusing on the carburetor. "Always looking for causes." "That's just it, though, isn't it? It's not just kids anymore." Tom took a long pull from his beer. "You got college students down at Ohio State protesting the war. You got Negroes all over the South demanding things change overnight. You got women burning their bras and talking about liberation. The whole world's gone crazy, George." George said nothing, but his hands stilled on the wrench. In the silence, they could hear the sounds of evening in suburbia. Screen doors slamming, children being called in for dinner, the distant sound of someone's television broadcasting the evening news. "The thing is," Tom continued, "a man's got to think about his family, about his reputation in the community, about his job security." He paused meaningfully. "Plant management doesn't look kindly on troublemakers, George. Workers who get their names associated with radical causes, who make waves. Well, there's always someone younger, hungrier, willing to take their place." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. George had seen it before. Workers who'd been too vocal about union business, too critical of management decisions, finding themselves laid off during the next reorganization. In a town like Millfield, where the GM plant was the largest employer, Being blacklisted could mean having to sell the house, move the family, start over somewhere else. "I appreciate your concern, Tom," George said carefully. "But Brian's just going through a phase. All kids rebel against their parents. He'll grow out of it." "Will he?" "Because from what I hear, he's not just talking about rebellion. He's talking about traveling to Alabama, about joining those communist agitators who are stirring up trouble in the South." George's grip tightened on the wrench. "Communist agitators? Wake up, George. You think this civil rights movement is some spontaneous uprising? It's being organized, funded, directed by outside forces. People who want to destroy the American way of life, who want to turn this country into some kind of socialist paradise." It was a familiar argument, one George had heard on talk radio and read in opinion columns. The idea that the civil rights movement was somehow un-American, driven by foreign influences rather than legitimate grievances. But looking at Tom's face, earnest, concerned, genuinely worried about the stability of their community, George realized how comforting that explanation must be. How much easier it was to blame outside agitators than to confront the possibility that America itself might be flawed. "These are American citizens, Tom. People who were born here, who work here, who pay taxes here. They're not trying to destroy America. They're trying to be part of it." Tom's expression hardened. "Is that what Margaret's been telling you? Because I've heard she's been reading those liberal magazines, talking to the other wives about civil rights and women's liberation and God knows what else." Heat flared in George's chest, a dangerous, protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. "Leave my wife out of this. I'm just saying, George, sometimes the people closest to us, the people we trust most, can be influenced by ideas that aren't in our best interests. Margaret's a good woman, but women are emotional creatures. They see pictures of violence on television, read stories in magazines, and they react with their hearts instead of their heads." George set down the wrench with deliberate care. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carrying an edge that made Tom lean back slightly. "Tom, I'm going to say this once. My wife is an intelligent, thoughtful woman who's perfectly capable of forming her own opinions. And my son is a decent kid who cares about right and wrong. If that makes them dangerous radicals, then maybe the problem isn't with them." They finished their beers in uncomfortable silence, the easy camaraderie of the last 17 years suddenly strained by forces neither of them fully understood. When Tom left, his parting words hung in the garage air like exhaust fumes. "Just remember, George, you've worked hard for what you have. Don't let other people's causes cost you everything you've built." That night, George lay in bed listening to Margaret's breathing, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Tom's words. The house around them was silent, except for the familiar settling sounds of a 17-year-old structure adjusting to the temperature changes of a March night. In the next room, Brian was presumably asleep, dreaming whatever dreams 16-year-old boys had in 1965. Dreams that now apparently included visions of justice and equality and marching for civil rights. Margaret stirred beside him, her hand finding his under the sheet. "Can't sleep," she whispered. "Tom Morrison stopped by tonight. I figured he might." "What did he want?" George turned to look at her profile in the darkness, the familiar curve of her cheek, the way her hair spread across the pillow. The woman he'd married when they were both young and certain they understood how the world worked. "To warn me about my family's dangerous political activities." Margaret was quiet for so long that George thought she'd fallen back asleep. Then she said, "Are we dangerous, George? Are we threatening the natural order of things by thinking that all Americans should be treated equally? I don't know anymore. A week ago I thought I knew right from wrong, black from white. Now," he sighed, "now I feel like everything I believed in is shifting under my feet." Margaret turned to face him, her hand touching his cheek in the darkness. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe some things need to shift. Easy for you to say. You don't have to worry about losing your job, about being branded as some kind of radical. You don't have to work alongside men who think your family has been infected by communist propaganda." "No," Margaret agreed. "I just have to worry about raising a son in a world where people are beaten for trying to vote. I have to worry about looking him in the eye and explaining why his parents chose comfort over conscience." George pulled her closer, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, the soap she used, the perfume she wore on Sundays. She was his anchor in a world that seemed increasingly unstable, the steady center around which his life revolved. But now even that center was shifting, moving towards something he wasn't sure he was ready to follow. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline light that made the frost on the windows look like delicate artwork. George had planned to spend the day winterizing the lawnmower and cleaning the gutters, the kind of maintenance tasks that kept a house functioning, and a man busy enough not to think too much about complicated questions. Instead, he found himself climbing the narrow stairs to the attic, following Margaret and Brian on what had started as a simple search for summer clothes and had somehow become an archaeological expedition into the Whitman family history. The attic was a repository of 17 years of married life, boxes of Christmas decorations, outdated kitchen appliances, Brian's outgrown clothes, and Margaret's carefully preserved wedding dress. But in the far corner, beneath a drop cloth that had once covered the dining room table during a painting project, sat a cedar chest that George hadn't opened in years. "This is where I found the journals," Brian said, lifting the heavy lid with the reverence of someone handling sacred texts. The chest exhaled the scent of cedar and mothballs, old wool and fading paper. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper yellowed with age, were the remnants of Patrick Whitman's life. A union card from Local 1219, photographs of men in overalls standing before a steel mill, newspaper clippings about strikes and organizing efforts, and 3 leather-bound journals filled with his father's careful handwriting. George lifted one of the journals, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The leather was cracked with age, the pages thick and substantial. The kind of journal a man bought when he had important things to record, thoughts worth preserving. "Listen to this," Brian said, opening another volume to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "This is from 1937 during the steel strike. The company brought in strikebreakers today, men desperate enough to cross a picket line for 30 cents an hour. I can't blame them for needing work, but I can't forgive them for weakening our cause. A man has to stand for something, even when standing costs him everything." Margaret sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, a photograph in her hands. "Look at this, George. Your father speaking at a union rally. He couldn't have been much older than Brian is now." George studied the photograph. Patrick Whitman stood on the back of a flatbed truck, his arm raised, his mouth open in mid-speech. Around him, hundreds of workers listened with the intense attention of people whose lives hung in the balance. It was a face George barely remembered. His father had died when George was 12, killed in an industrial accident at the very mill he'd spent years trying to organize. He was 22 when he wrote this, Brian said, turning pages carefully. "Listen, Mary says I'm too idealistic, that I should think about our future together instead of wasting time on lost causes. But how can I build a future on a foundation of injustice? How can I ask her to marry a man who's willing to look the other way when his fellow workers are treated like animals?" George's throat tightened. Mary, his mother, who had rarely spoken of Patrick after his death, who had raised George with the philosophy that keeping your head down and staying out of trouble was the key to survival. "Here's another one," Brian continued, his voice growing more excited. "The Negro workers at the foundry make half what we do for the same work. When I suggested we include equal pay in our demands, half the men walked out of the meeting. They're willing to fight for their own rights, but not for their brothers' rights. This is how the bosses keep us weak, by turning us against each other instead of against the system that exploits us all." Margaret looked up from the photograph. "He sounds like Brian." "He sounds like a communist," George said automatically, then stopped, hearing Tom Morrison's voice in his own words. "Does he?" Margaret asked quietly. "Or does he sound like someone who believed in fairness, in justice, in the idea that all men are created equal?" George took the journal from Brian's hands and read the passage himself. The words were in his father's handwriting. He remembered that careful script from birthday cards and Christmas presents, from the few letters Patrick had written during business trips to other cities to speak at organizing meetings. "December 15th, 1936, George read aloud. "George asked me today why I spend so much time at union meetings instead of playing catch with him in the backyard. So I told him that I'm fighting for a world where he won't have to choose between feeding his family and standing up for what's right. Someday, I hope he'll understand that a man who doesn't fight for justice isn't much of a man at all." The attic fell silent, except for the sound of wind rattling the windows and the distant hum of Saturday morning traffic on Elm Street. George closed the journal and looked at his son, really looked at him, seeing not the rebellious teenager he'd been worrying about, but a young man grappling with the same moral questions his grandfather had faced 30 years earlier. "There's more," Brian said softly, lifting another journal. "From 1938, after the strike ended, we won. The company agreed to our terms. Better wages, safer working conditions, recognition of the union. But the real victory wasn't in the contract. It was in watching ordinary men discover they had power when they stood together. It was in seeing fear transform into courage, resignation transform into hope." George picked up one of the photographs, a group shot of union organizers, his father in the center with his arm around a black man in overalls. Both men were smiling, their faces bright with the exhaustion and exhilaration of people who had fought for something and won. "I never knew he worked with colored workers," George said, using the term that had seemed polite in 1965, but now felt insufficient, somehow diminishing. "Look at the back," Margaret said. George turned the photograph over, in his father's handwriting, with Thomas Jefferson Washington, "the best organizer and finest man I've ever known. Together, we proved that solidarity knows no color." March 1938. "Thomas Jefferson Washington," Brian repeated. Even his name sounds like freedom. George studied his father's face in the photograph, looking for clues to the man he'd barely known. Patrick Whitman had been 24 when this picture was taken, younger than George was now, but there was something in his eyes, a certainty and purpose that George had never felt in his own life. "There's something else," Brian said, pulling a manila envelope from the bottom of the chest. "Letters, from people Grandpa helped organize. Look at this one." The letter was dated April 15, 1939, written on cheap paper in a careful, educated hand. "Dear Patrick, I wanted you to know that the scholarship fund you helped establish has allowed my son, Marcus, to enroll at Ohio State University. He will be the first in our family to attend college. When you spoke at our church last month, you said that education was the key to breaking the chains that bind us. You were right. Marcus carries not just our hopes, but the hopes of everyone who believes that tomorrow can be better than today. Your friend in solidarity, Thomas Jefferson Washington." Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "He helped establish a scholarship fund?" George found himself remembering fragments. His mother counting coins at the kitchen table, saying they were for Patrick's fund. Christmas mornings when there were fewer presents under the tree, because Daddy's helping some families who need it more. He'd never understood what it meant, had assumed it was just adult business, not worth a child's attention. Now he realized that his father had been systematically sacrificing his own family's comfort to help others, not just white workers, but black workers and their children, people who faced barriers George had never had to consider. "Here's the last entry," Brian said, his voice thick with emotion. "From December 1940, just a few months before he died. George is 10 now, old enough to understand that the world isn't always fair. I've tried to teach him by example that a man's worth isn't measured by what he accumulates but by what he contributes. Someday when I'm gone, I hope he'll remember that justice delayed is justice denied, and that silence in the face of injustice makes us complicit in that injustice." George set the photograph down carefully, his hands trembling slightly. For 27 years he'd constructed his life as a reaction against his father's idealism, choosing security over principle, comfort over conscience. He told himself it was wisdom, maturity, the natural evolution from youthful passion to adult pragmatism. But sitting in this dusty attic, surrounded by the evidence of his father's convictions, George began to wonder if what he'd called wisdom was actually cowardice. "He would have been proud of you," Margaret said to Brian, "standing up for what you believe in even when it's difficult." Brian looked at his father. "Would he have been proud of you, Dad?" It was a simple question, delivered without malice or judgment, but it hit George like a physical blow. Would Patrick Whitman have been proud of his son's comfortable, conventional life? Would he have approved of George's determination to stay out of trouble, to avoid controversy, to build a safe, predictable existence for his family? "I don't know," George said quietly. "I honestly don't know." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of generations pressing down on them in that small space under the eaves. Finally, Margaret began carefully repacking the journals and photographs, handling them with the reverence due to sacred relics. "We should go," she said. "It's getting cold up here." But as they prepared to leave, Brian pulled out one more item from the chest, a small leather-bound notebook, different from the others. Inside, on the first page, was a list of principles written in Patrick Whitman's hand. 1. A man's character is defined not by what he says, but by what he does when no one is watching. 2. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. 3. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. 4. We must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools. 5. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. The second one, Brian said. That's from Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. And the fourth one, he said that in a speech last year. George stared at the list. Your grandfather wrote this in 1939. Martin Luther King was 10 years old. The ideas aren't new, Dad. The struggle isn't new. It's just that some people have been fighting it longer than others. As they climbed down from the attic, George felt as though he was carrying more than boxes of family memorabilia. He was carrying the weight of his father's expectations, the burden of his son's idealism, and the growing realization that the comfortable middle ground he'd occupied for so long might not be tenable anymore. That evening, after a dinner that felt strained despite Margaret's attempts at normal conversation, George found himself alone in the living room with the radio. Brian had retreated to his room to do homework, and Margaret was in the kitchen doing dishes, the familiar sounds of domestic routine providing a soundtrack to George's increasingly troubled thoughts. The Zenith console radio sat in the corner where it had held court for the past 8 years, its walnut cabinet polished to a rich glow, its dial glowing amber in the gathering darkness. George twisted the knob, moving past the local stations with their bland mix of pop music and farm reports, searching for something that might help him make sense of the world that seemed to be shifting beneath his feet. He found WCKY out of Cincinnati, where a late-night talk show was taking calls about the situation in Alabama. The host, a man named Jerry Williams, had a gravelly voice and strong opinions about everything from the communist threat to the decline of American values. You're on the air with Jerry Williams. What's on your mind tonight? Jerry, this is Bob from Dayton. I just wanted to say that I think you're absolutely right about these so-called civil rights demonstrations. These people aren't interested in equality. They want special treatment. They want something for nothing. That's exactly right, Bob. And what worries me is how many decent, hard-working Americans are being taken in by this propaganda. People who should know better are starting to believe that somehow America is the villain in this story. George settled back in his armchair, the same chair where he'd listened to baseball games and comedy shows, where he'd dozed off during Sunday evening programs while Brian played at his feet. Now he was listening to voices that should have comforted him, voices that reflected the opinions he'd held just a week ago, but instead of comfort, he felt a growing unease. Next caller, you're on with Jerry Williams. Jerry, this is Ruth from Springfield. I'm a school teacher, and I have to tell you, I'm seeing changes in my students that worry me. They're asking questions about segregation, about voting rights, about things that frankly aren't appropriate for children to be thinking about. Someone is filling their heads with ideas that are dividing this country. Ruth, you've hit the nail on the head. This isn't spontaneous. This is organized indoctrination. And it's happening in our schools, in our churches, even in our own homes. Parents need to take back control before it's too late. George thought about Brian upstairs, probably reading more of Patrick's journals, absorbing lessons about justice and solidarity that George himself was only beginning to understand. Was that indoctrination? Or was it education? He twisted the dial again, looking for a different perspective. On WLW, another late-night program, was featuring interviews with civil rights workers just returned from Alabama. We're talking tonight with Reverend James Abernathy, who was on the Edmund Pettus Bridge last Sunday. Reverend Abernathy, can you describe what you witnessed? Thank you for having me. What I witnessed was a systematic attempt to deny American citizens their constitutional right to vote. But more than that, I witnessed courage in the face of hatred, dignity in the face of violence. Those young people who were beaten, they didn't fight back. They didn't throw stones or curse their attackers. They simply stood up and walked forward, knowing they might die for the privilege of being treated as human beings. The voice was cultured, educated, carrying the cadences of the Southern Baptist Church, but also something else, a weariness that came from fighting a battle that never seemed to end. There are people who say these demonstrations are moving too fast. That change takes time. Brother, we have been waiting for 100 years. How much time is enough? How many generations of children have to grow up believing they're inferior because of the color of their skin? How many Americans have to die before we decide that equality isn't a privilege to be earned, but a right to be claimed? George found himself leaning forward, drawn in despite himself. This wasn't the radical rhetoric he'd expected, the communist propaganda Tom Morrison had warned him about. This was a man talking about American values, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the promises that George himself had grown up believing in. What would you say to white Americans who are sympathetic but don't know how to help? I would say that neutrality is not an option. Edmund Burke said that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. We're not asking anyone to become a revolutionary. We're asking them to become Americans, to live up to the principles this country was founded on. The radio crackled with static as a distant thunderstorm interfered with the signal. George adjusted the antenna, trying to bring the voice back clearly, but the program was ending, the Reverend's words fading into the electronic hiss of the night. In the kitchen, Margaret was finishing the dishes, the familiar sound of water running and plates clinking together. Upstairs, Brian's light was still on. George could see it beneath his bedroom door when he went to get a glass of water. The house was settling into its nighttime rhythms, the same patterns that had governed their lives for 17 years. But something was different now. The comfortable certainties that had defined the Whitman family were giving way to questions that demanded answers, choices that couldn't be avoided indefinitely. George returned to the radio, spinning the dial through late-night music programs and religious broadcasts, agricultural reports and weather updates. Finally, he found a station playing jazz. Miles Davis, maybe, or John Coltrane, the kind of music he'd never paid much attention to, but that now seemed to capture something essential about the complexity of American life. The music was contemplative, searching, full of questions without easy answers. It reminded him of his father's journals, of Brian's passionate arguments, of the photographs in the attic showing Patrick Whitman standing shoulder to shoulder with Thomas Jefferson Washington. As the evening deepened into night, George sat in his chair listening to the jazz and thinking about the choices that lay ahead. He thought about Tom Morrison's warnings, about job security and social stability, and the comfortable life he'd built for his family. But he also thought about the young woman on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, unconscious but still clutching her American flag. Somewhere between Miles Davis and midnight, George Whitman began to understand that the most important battles weren't fought on distant bridges in Alabama, but in the hearts and minds of ordinary people who had to decide every single day what kind of Americans they wanted to be. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of pale March sunlight that promised spring but didn't quite deliver. The Whitman family prepared for church with their usual routine. George in his blue suit and striped tie, Margaret in her floral dress with the matching hat, Brian reluctantly tucked into khakis and a button-down shirt that made him look younger than his 16 years. First Presbyterian Church of Millfield sat on Main Street like a granite monument to stability and tradition. Built in 1897, its stone walls had witnessed decades of baptisms, weddings, and funerals, the predictable rhythms of small-town life. The Whitmans occupied the same pew they'd claimed 17 years ago, third row from the front, right side, where George could see the choir loft and Margaret could keep an eye on Brian during the longer sermons. Reverend Dr. Samuel Morrison, Tom Morrison's older brother, was a tall, austere man who'd been preaching to the congregation for nearly 20 years. His sermons were carefully crafted theological exercises that rarely strayed into controversial territory, focusing instead on personal salvation, moral rectitude, and the importance of maintaining Christian values in an increasingly secular world. But this morning, as the congregation settled into their pews and the organ played the opening hymn, George noticed something different in the Reverend's demeanor. There was a tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that suggested the events of the past week had penetrated even the carefully controlled environment of First Presbyterian. "Before we begin our service," Reverend Morrison announced, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary, "I want to address the tragic events that occurred last Sunday in Selma, Alabama. As Christians, we must pray for all those who were injured and we must seek God's guidance in these troubled times. George felt Margaret stiffen beside him. Around the sanctuary, he could see people shifting in their pews, the comfortable predictability of their Sunday morning routine suddenly disrupted by the intrusion of real-world controversy. Now, some of you may have strong feelings about these civil rights demonstrations. Some may support them, others may oppose them. But as your pastor, I want to remind you that our faith calls us to love our neighbors as ourselves, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. A murmur rippled through the congregation. Mrs. Henderson, the bank president's wife, was whispering urgently to her husband. Behind them, the Kowalski family sat in stony silence, their faces revealing nothing of their thoughts. However, the Reverend continued, his voice growing stronger, we must also remember that change comes through prayer and patience, not through confrontation and conflict. The Apostle Paul taught us to be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. Brian's jaw tightened. George could feel his son's anger radiating through the narrow space between them, the familiar tension that had become a constant presence in their household over the past week. The young people in our community, and I know there are some here today, may be tempted to involve themselves in these political movements. But I urge you to remember that your first duty is to your families, your education, and your relationship with God. The problems of the world will not be solved by youthful passion or misguided idealism. The sermon that followed was a careful navigation of biblical passages about patience, submission to authority, and the dangers of pride. Reverend Morrison never mentioned Selma directly again, but his message was clear. Good Christians stayed out of politics, focused on their own salvation, and trusted God to work out the larger problems of society in his own time. As they filed out of church after the service, George could feel the weight of unspoken conversations pressing down on the congregation. People who had known each other for decades were suddenly unsure what to say, uncertain where their neighbors stood on questions that had seemed safely distant just a week earlier. "Fine sermon," Tom Morrison said, catching up with them on the church steps. "Samuel always knows how to put things in perspective." Margaret's smile was polite but strained. "It's certainly given us all something to think about." "Not much to think about if you ask me," Tom replied. "The Bible's pretty clear on these matters. We're called to be peacemakers, not troublemakers." Brian, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "What about, 'Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness'? What about, 'Let justice roll down like waters'? Seems to me the Bible has something to say about standing up for what's right, too." Tom's face darkened. "Careful, young man. It's easy to quote scripture when you don't understand the context." "I understand that Jesus spent his time with the outcasts and the oppressed," Brian shot back. "I understand that he challenged the authorities when they were wrong, even when it got him in trouble." "Brian," George warned, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "No, Dad, I'm tired of pretending that following Christ means keeping quiet while people suffer. I'm tired of hearing that patience is a virtue when patience just means letting injustice continue." The small crowd that had gathered around them fell silent. Mrs. Patterson, Brian's vice principal, was listening with the sharp attention of someone gathering intelligence. The bank president was frowning, his wife clutching his arm as if she expected violence to break out on the church steps. Tom Morrison stepped closer to Brian, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Son, you're walking down a dangerous path. You keep talking like this and you're going to find yourself in more trouble than you can handle." That's when George stepped forward. "Tom," he said quietly, but with an edge that made several people turn to look, "if you have something to say to my son, you can say it to me first." For a moment, the two men faced each other on the steps of First Presbyterian Church. 17 years of friendship, suddenly strained by forces neither of them fully understood. Tom's face was flushed with anger and frustration, while George felt a strange calm settling over him, a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. "I'm trying to help you, George," Tom said finally. "I'm trying to keep your family from making a mistake that could destroy everything you've worked for." "Maybe," George replied. "What I've worked for isn't worth preserving if it means turning my back on people who need help." The words surprised him, as much as they surprised everyone else. He hadn't planned to make a public declaration, hadn't intended to draw a line in the sand of Millfield society, but standing there on the church steps with his son beside him and his wife's hand in his, George realized that some choices couldn't be avoided forever. Tom Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're going to regret this, George. Mark my words, you're going to regret this." As they walked home through the quiet streets of Millfield, past the neat lawns and modest houses that had represented everything George wanted from life, he felt as though he was seeing his neighborhood for the first time. The American flags hanging from front porches looked different now, not just symbols of patriotism, but questions about what patriotism really meant. The children playing in their yards represented not just innocence but potential, the next generation that would inherit whatever world the adults managed to create. "Thank you," Brian said quietly as they turned onto Elm Street. "For what?" "For standing up for me. For finally taking a side." George looked at his son, really looked at him, seeing not just the rebellious teenager who left his clothes on the bedroom floor, but a young man grappling with moral questions that adults had been avoiding for generations. "I'm not sure what side I'm on yet," George said honestly, "but I'm starting to think that not choosing a side is a choice too." Margaret squeezed his arm. "Your father would have been proud of you today." As they reached their house, the same house they'd lived in for 17 years, with its familiar white siding and green shutters and carefully maintained garden, George realized that everything was about to change. Not the house itself, perhaps, but everything it represented. The comfortable certainties, the predictable routines, the safe distance from the world's troubles. Tom Morrison had been right about one thing. George was about to make choices that could cost him everything he'd worked for. But for the first time in years, he was beginning to understand that some things were worth more than security, more than comfort, more than the approval of neighbors who had never been asked to risk anything for their beliefs. Inside, Margaret put Sunday dinner on the table. Pot roast with potatoes and carrots, green beans from their garden that she'd canned the previous autumn, fresh rolls with butter and jam. The same meal she'd served hundreds of Sunday afternoons, the anchor that had held their family together, through all the small storms and celebrations of 17 years of marriage. But as they bowed their heads for grace, George found himself thinking not about gratitude for their blessings, but about responsibility for their choices. And when he raised his head and looked across the table at his wife and son, he saw not just the family he'd worked to protect, but the family he was finally ready to lead toward something bigger than their own comfort and security. The radio in the kitchen was playing softly, just background music, nothing political or controversial. But George could hear, underneath the familiar melodies, the sound of change coming. It was distant still, like thunder before a storm, but it was definitely coming. And for the first time in his adult life, George Whitman was ready to meet it head-on. Monday morning arrived like a reckoning. George woke to the same alarm, went through the same routine, but everything felt different. The coffee tasted bitter, the newspaper seemed heavier in his hands, and the familiar sounds of his neighborhood carried an undercurrent of tension he'd never noticed before. At the plant, the change was immediate and unmistakable. Conversation stopped when George entered the break room. Men who had shared lunch with him for 17 years now found reasons to sit at different tables. The easy camaraderie of the assembly line was replaced by a careful politeness that felt more dangerous than outright hostility. Tom Morrison worked his station 2 positions down, installing rear-view mirrors with mechanical precision, but he might as well have been on another planet. The friendship that had sustained them both through layoffs, family troubles, and the ordinary struggles of working-class life had been severed by George's public stand at the church. "Heard you caused quite a stir yesterday," Frank Kowalski said during the morning break, settling beside George with his coffee and Polish newspaper. "Tom's telling anyone who'll listen that you've gone soft on the communists." George stirred his coffee with a plastic spoon, watching the cream swirl into brown patterns. "What do you think, Frank?" The older man was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "I think a man's got to answer to his own conscience. In Poland, before the war, we learned what happens when good people stay quiet too long. It was the closest thing to support George had received all morning, but it came with its own weight of history and implication. Frank had never talked much about the old country, about whatever experiences had driven him to seek a new life in Millfield, Ohio. Now George wondered what Frank had seen, what choices he'd faced that made him understand the price of silence. At lunch, George sat alone with his ham sandwich and thermos of coffee, listening to the radio drone about Vietnam troop deployments and spring training statistics. The normalcy of it, the everyday concerns of America going about its business, felt surreal against the backdrop of his personal revolution. George. He looked up to see Bill Patterson, the plant supervisor, standing beside his table. Patterson was a company man through and through, someone who'd worked his way up from the line to management by never making waves, never challenging decisions, never giving the front office any reason to question his loyalty. "Mr. Patterson, walk with me." They left the break room and walked out to the loading dock, where trucks delivered parts and materials for the assembly line. The March air was still cold, but George was grateful for the privacy, the chance to have this conversation away from the curious eyes and ears of his co-workers. "I'm going to be straight with you, George," Patterson said, lighting a cigarette with hands that shook slightly. "There's been some concern upstairs about your activities, your political activities. I haven't engaged in any political activities at work. No, but what you do on your own time reflects on this company, especially when it involves radical causes, communist sympathizers." "Communist sympathizers." George's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. "Bill, these are American citizens trying to vote. How is that communist?" Patterson held up a hand. "I'm not here to debate politics with you, George. I'm here to give you some friendly advice. You've got a good job here. 17 years of service, a pension building up. Don't throw it all away for causes that don't really concern you." The same words Tom Morrison had used, the same logic that had governed George's life for so long. Keep your head down, stay out of trouble, focus on your own family's welfare. It was practical advice, sensible advice, the kind of wisdom that had built the stable, predictable life George had always thought he wanted. "And if I don't take your friendly advice?" Patterson's expression hardened. "Then we'll have to evaluate whether your continued employment is in the best interests of the company and your fellow workers. There's a lot of young men out there looking for good jobs, George. Men who understand the importance of loyalty and discretion." The threat was delivered with the calm professionalism of a man who'd fired dozens of workers over the years, always with justification, always with proper documentation. George understood that he was being given one last chance to step back from the line he'd crossed, to return to the comfortable anonymity of the faithful employee who caused no trouble and asked no questions. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Patterson," George said finally. "I'll certainly take your advice under consideration." But as he walked back to his station, George realized that the decision had already been made. Not consciously, not through any process of logical reasoning, but through the accumulated weight of everything he'd learned over the past week. His father's journals, Brian's passionate arguments, the photographs of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the Reverend's words about justice rolling down like waters. He couldn't go back. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences for his family's security, he couldn't pretend anymore that neutrality was an option. That evening, the Whitman family gathered around the kitchen table for what had become their new ritual. Not just dinner, but a daily reckoning with the moral questions that had invaded their comfortable suburban life. Margaret had made meatloaf with mashed potatoes. Brian had actually combed his hair, and George had brought home a tension that seemed to fill the room like smoke. "How was work today?" Margaret asked, though the careful way she phrased the question suggested she already suspected the answer. "Patterson pulled me aside, told me my political activities were causing concern upstairs." Brian looked up from his mashed potatoes, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "What political activities? You haven't done anything except stand up for me at church." That was enough, apparently. Margaret reached across the table to touch George's hand. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd take his advice under consideration." George met her eyes. "But we all know I'm not going to." The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the clock and the distant sound of a neighbor starting his car in the driveway next door. Through the window, George could see the lights coming on in houses up and down Elm Street, families settling into their evening routines behind the drawn curtains of their comfortable, predictable lives. "They can't fire you for what you believe," Brian said, but his voice carried more hope than conviction. "They can fire me for any reason they want, son, or for no reason at all." George pushed his meatloaf around his plate, his appetite gone. "The question is, what do we do about it?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her practical nature warring with something else. the same sense of moral urgency that had been growing in all of them over the past week. "We could move," she said finally. "Your brother Jack is always saying they need skilled workers at the Ford plant in Detroit. We could start over somewhere else." "Running away won't solve anything," Brian said. "Besides, this isn't just about Dad's job. This is about what we believe in, what we're willing to fight for." George studied his son's face, seeing again the echo of Patrick Whitman's passion, the same fire that had driven his father to risk everything for his convictions. But Brian was 16, too young to understand the full weight of what he was advocating, too young to know that courage was easy when you had nothing to lose. "There's something else," George said, "something I've been thinking about since yesterday." Both Margaret and Brian looked at him expectantly. "I want to go to Alabama. I want to see Selma for myself." The words hung in the kitchen air like a challenge to everything they'd built together. Margaret's face went pale, and Brian's eyes widened with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "George," Margaret said carefully, "what exactly are you talking about?" "I'm talking about getting in the car and driving down there. I'm talking about seeing what's happening with my own eyes instead of just reading about it in the newspaper or listening to it on the radio." "That's over 600 miles, Margaret protested, "and it's dangerous." "You've seen the news reports. There's violence, police brutality, which is exactly why someone needs to witness it. Someone needs to see what's being done in America's name and decide whether we can live with it." Brian was leaning forward now, his dinner forgotten. "You really mean it? You'd actually go?" "We'd actually go, all of us." Margaret's fork clattered to her plate. "All of us. This isn't just my decision anymore, Margaret. It affects all of us. Brian's been talking about going down there anyway. At least this way we go together as a family. George, think about what you're saying. Think about the risks, not just to us, but to our future. If you lose your job, if we have to leave Millfield, then we'll leave Millfield, we'll figure something out." George reached for her hand again, feeling the calluses from 17 years of keeping house, raising a family, being the steady center around which their life revolved. "But I can't keep pretending that what happens to other people doesn't matter to me. I can't keep telling Brian to stay out of trouble when the real trouble is staying out." Margaret looked around their kitchen, at the Formica table where they'd eaten thousands of meals, at the window where she'd watched Brian grow from a toddler to a young man, at the life they'd built together through patience and hard work and careful compromise. "If we do this," she said slowly, "there's no going back. Once we take a stand like this, once we involve ourselves in something this big, I know. People will remember. People in this town, people at your work, people at church, will be marked as troublemakers, radicals, people who couldn't mind their own business. I know that too." Brian reached across the table to grab both his parents' hands. "So we'll be troublemakers. So what? At least we'll be troublemakers who stood up for what's right." Margaret looked at her husband and son, these two men who had somehow found the courage she was still searching for. Outside, Elm Street looked the same as always. Modest houses with neat lawns, cars parked in driveways, the comfortable predictability of suburban America going about its evening business. But inside the Whitman house, something fundamental had shifted. The careful balance that had governed their lives for 17 years, security versus principle, comfort versus conscience, had finally tipped towards something more dangerous and more necessary. "When do we leave?" she asked quietly. George felt something release in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "Friday after work. We'll drive straight through, be there by Saturday morning." "What about school?" Margaret asked. "What about your job?" "I'll call in sick. Brian can miss a few days of classes." George squeezed both their hands. "Some things are more important than perfect attendance." As they finished dinner and cleared the table, the Whitman family moved through their familiar routines with a new sense of purpose. Margaret began making mental lists of what to pack, how much money they'd need, what to tell the neighbors. Brian disappeared upstairs to find Alabama on his road atlas, to calculate distances and driving times. George sat in his chair with the evening paper, but instead of reading the sports section, he found himself studying the news reports from the South, trying to prepare himself for what they might encounter. On the radio, the evening DJ was playing The Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel, and the words seemed to speak directly to George's newly awakened conscience. "Fools," said I, "you do not know silence like a cancer grows." For 17 years, George Whitman had chosen silence, had embraced the comfortable ignorance of a man who minded his own business and let the world's troubles stay safely distant. But silence, he was beginning to understand, was not neutrality. Silence was complicity. And he was done being silent. The rest of the week passed in a strange mixture of routine and revolution. George went to work each morning, performed his duties on the assembly line with mechanical precision, and endured the careful politeness of co-workers who no longer knew what to make of him. But underneath the surface normalcy, he was preparing for a journey that would change everything. On Tuesday evening, he spread road maps across the kitchen table, tracing the route from Millfield to Selma with his finger, while Margaret and Brian looked over his shoulders. 840 miles through Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Alabama, states that had seemed as foreign as Europe just a week ago, but now represented a pilgrimage they needed to make. We'll take Route 23 south to Portsmouth, then catch 52 across into Kentucky, George explained, his voice carrying the same careful attention to detail he brought to every project. From there, it's mostly back roads until we hit the interstate system. Margaret studied the map with the practical eye of a woman who'd managed a household budget for 17 years. How much will it cost? Gas, food, maybe a motel room. I've been thinking about that. We'll pack sandwiches, bring thermoses of coffee, sleep in the car if we have to. Brian looked up from the atlas. Dad, what if we get there and there's nothing happening? What if the marches are over, the protesters have gone home? It was a reasonable question, one that had occurred to George as well. The news report suggested that the civil rights organizations were regrouping after Bloody Sunday, planning their next moves, but there was no guarantee that the Whitmans' timing would coincide with any significant events. Then we'll see the bridge, George said. We'll talk to people, try to understand what happened there. Sometimes witnessing is just as important as participating. On Wednesday, Margaret began the subtle process of preparing their absence. She called her sister in Columbus to ask if she could check on the house over the weekend. She arranged for Mrs. Peterson next door to collect their mail. She stocked the refrigerator as if they were going away for a vacation rather than a moral reckoning. What should I tell people? She asked George as they lay in bed Wednesday night, their voices low in the darkness. If anyone asks where we've gone, tell them we're visiting relatives in Alabama. We don't have relatives in Alabama. We do now. Everyone fighting for civil rights is family, whether they know it or not. Margaret was quiet for a moment, processing this new version of her husband, the man who spoke in metaphors about universal brotherhood, who had traded comfortable pragmatism for uncomfortable principle. Are you scared? She asked. George considered the question honestly. Terrified, but not of what might happen to us down there. I'm terrified of what happens to us if we don't go. On Thursday, Brian came home from school with news that added urgency to their plans. Mrs. Patterson had called him into her office again, ostensibly to discuss his academic progress, but actually to probe about his family's political activities. She asked if you and Mom were planning to do anything that might embarrass the school district, Brian reported over dinner. I told her I didn't know what she was talking about. George set down his fork, his jaw tightening. She has no right to question you about our family's private business. Technically, she probably does, Margaret said, with the weary wisdom of someone who'd learned to navigate small-town politics. The school board is elected, and elected officials don't like controversy. All the more reason to leave tomorrow, George said, before they decide to make this official. That night, George found himself unable to sleep. He walked through their house in the darkness, touching familiar objects. The photographs on the mantel, the books on Margaret's shelf, the wooden bowl where he emptied his pockets every evening. 17 years of accumulated life, the physical evidence of choices made and dreams pursued within the safe boundaries of middle American respectability. By morning, none of it would matter as much as it had yesterday. Friday dawned gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that turned March in Ohio into an endurance test. George called the plant at 6 a.m., telling the supervisor he was coming down with the flu and wouldn't be in for the rest of the week. It was the first sick day he'd taken in 3 years, and he could hear the suspicion in the man's voice. Hope you feel better soon, George. Don't want this thing spreading around the plant. I'll do my best to keep it contained, George replied, and hung up before the irony of his words could fully register. By 7 a.m., the Impala was loaded with everything they thought they'd need, Suitcases with 3 days' worth of clothes, a cooler packed with sandwiches and cold drinks, thermoses of coffee, road maps, and a small amount of cash that represented most of their savings account. Margaret had also packed a first aid kit, as if they were heading into a war zone rather than to a small town in Alabama. Brian emerged from the house carrying his grandfather's journals, wrapped carefully in a towel. "I thought we should bring these," he said, his voice carrying a solemnity that made him sound older than his 16 years. George nodded, understanding instinctively that the journals were more than historical documents. They were a connection to the moral courage that had somehow skipped a generation, but was now reasserting itself in ways that Patrick Whitman could never have imagined. As they backed out of the driveway, George caught a glimpse of Tom Morrison's face in his kitchen window. Their former friend was watching their departure with an expression that mixed disappointment, anger, and something that might have been concern. For a moment, George considered stopping, trying to explain, maybe even trying to convince Tom to understand what they were doing. But the moment passed, and the Impala turned onto Main Street, heading south toward whatever awaited them in Alabama. The first 100 miles passed in relative silence, broken only by Margaret's quiet directions and the radio's mixture of pop music and news updates. They drove through the familiar landscape of southern Ohio, rolling farmland dotted with barns and silos, small towns that looked exactly like Millfield, the comfortable geography of lives lived within predictable boundaries. But as they crossed into Kentucky, something shifted. The landscape began to change. The hills were steeper, the accents on the radio more pronounced, the very air seeming to carry different possibilities. They were leaving their known world behind, venturing into territory where the rules they'd lived by for 17 years might not apply. "Second thoughts?" Margaret asked as they stopped for gas in a small town whose name George couldn't pronounce. He considered the question, while the attendant filled their tank and cleaned their windshield. Behind them, the highway stretched north toward home, toward safety, toward the comfortable predictability of their old life. Ahead, the road disappeared into hills that could have been another country entirely. "None," he said, and realized he meant it. They drove through Kentucky in the afternoon sunshine that had finally burned off the morning's clouds, the Impala eating up the miles on highways that gradually deteriorated from 4-lane interstates to 2-lane country roads. The landscape changed as they traveled south, the neat farms of Ohio giving way to rougher terrain, the billboards advertising different products, the radio stations playing music that sounded foreign to ears accustomed to the bland pop of northern stations. In Tennessee, they stopped for dinner at a small restaurant that advertised home cooking and all welcome. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and tired eyes, took their order with the professional friendliness of someone who'd served thousands of travelers over the years. But as they waited for their food, George became aware of the conversations at nearby tables, voices discussing outside agitators and uppity Negras with a casual hatred that made his stomach clench. These weren't the carefully coded conversations of Ohio, where prejudice hid behind euphemisms and political rhetoric. This was raw, undisguised hostility toward people whose only crime was demanding equal treatment under the law. "Maybe we should eat in the car," Margaret whispered, her face pale. "No." George's voice was quiet, but firm. "We're not doing anything wrong. We're just a family having dinner." But when the waitress brought their food, country fried steak and mashed potatoes that would have been delicious under other circumstances, George found himself eating quickly, eager to get back on the road. The comfortable anonymity they'd counted on as travelers was compromised by something in their bearing, their clothes, their very presence that marked them as outsiders in a way they'd never experienced before. As they left the restaurant, the waitress followed them to the door. "You all be careful now," she said quietly. "Roads can be dangerous at night, especially for folks who don't know their way around." It might have been genuine concern for their safety, or it might have been a warning. Either way, George felt the weight of it as they climbed back into the Impala and continued south into the gathering darkness. They drove through the night, taking turns at the wheel while the others dozed fitfully in the passenger seats. The radio played country music and gospel programs, late-night talk shows where callers discussed everything from UFO sightings to communist infiltration of the civil rights movement. It was America, but an America the Whitmans had never seen before. Rural, conservative, suspicious of change and outsiders. "How much farther?" Brian asked as George drove through the pre-dawn darkness, his son's voice thick with exhaustion. George checked the odometer and did quick mental calculations. Maybe 200 miles. We should be there by mid-morning. In the east, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, not the gray, hesitant dawn of Ohio in March, but the bold, sudden sunrise of the deep south. As they crossed into Alabama, the landscape changed again, flatter than Kentucky, more agricultural, with vast fields of cotton stubble and pine forests that seemed to stretch to the horizon. And everywhere, scattered along the roadside like punctuation marks in a sentence about American history, were the artifacts of segregation, separate restrooms marked white and colored, water fountains side by side but distinctly different, restaurants with signs that didn't need to spell out their policies because everyone understood the rules. Margaret gasped when she saw her first whites-only sign, as if the reality of segregation had finally penetrated the comfortable abstraction of newspaper reports and television coverage. "I never imagined," she said quietly. "I mean, I knew it existed, but seeing it, it's real," Brian said, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and determination. "This is what we're fighting against." As the sun rose higher, they began to see other cars on the highway, some traveling north away from whatever was happening in Selma, others heading south like themselves. It was impossible to tell which were local residents going about their daily business and which were pilgrims like the Whitmans drawn by conscience or curiosity to witness history in the making. They reached Selma, Alabama at 9:47 a.m. on Saturday, March 13, 1965. The town looked smaller than George had expected, more ordinary. Tree-lined streets with modest houses, a downtown business district that could have been transplanted from any American town, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and life moved at the pace of the seasons. But as they drove through the streets, looking for some sign of the momentous events that had brought them 800 miles from home, George began to notice details that marked this as a place where history was being made. Groups of people, mostly black but some white, gathered on corners and in front of churches, their conversations animated but conducted in voices too low to overhear. Police cars seemed more numerous than necessary for a town of 28,000, their occupants watching the gatherings with obvious suspicion. And then they saw the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It was smaller than the photographs had suggested, less imposing than George had imagined. Just a concrete and steel span across the Alabama River, named for a Confederate general and Ku Klux Klan leader carrying U.S. Highway 80 from Selma toward Montgomery. But as they drove across it slowly, George felt the weight of everything that had happened here 6 days earlier. This was where John Lewis had been beaten unconscious. This was where Amelia Boynton had been photographed lying motionless on the pavement. This was where the dream of American equality had collided with the nightmare of American hatred, and the whole world had watched. "Stop," Margaret said suddenly. "Pull over." George parked the Impala at the far end of the bridge, and they got out, standing in the mild Alabama sunshine and looking back toward town. From this perspective, they could see what the marchers had seen, a gentle incline rising to the crest of the bridge, then falling away toward the other side. It would have been impossible to see what awaited them until they reached the top, impossible to know that a line of state troopers was waiting with clubs and tear gas. "They came this far," Brian said quietly, reading from one of his grandfather's journals. 525 people, just wanting to walk to Montgomery, just wanting to vote. A car pulled up behind them, a battered Chevrolet with Tennessee license plates. 3 young people got out, 2 white women and a black man, all in their early 20s, all carrying backpacks and wearing the kind of clothes that marked them as college students. They nodded politely to the Whitmans and walked to the edge of the bridge where they stood in silence, their presence adding to the weight of the moment. "You folks here for the march?" one of the young women asked, approaching the Whitmans with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to talking to strangers. "What march?" George asked. "Tomorrow. Dr. King and the others are leading another march from Brown Chapel to Montgomery. They're calling it the March for Justice and Dignity." Margaret looked at George, her eyes asking the question neither of them wanted to voice. Had they come this far only to participate in another confrontation, another potential bloodbath? "Will it be safe?" she asked. The young woman's smile was sad and knowing. "Probably not, but neither was riding the bus in Montgomery. Neither was sitting at lunch counters in Greensboro. Safety isn't really the point anymore. As they drove into town looking for a place to stay and something to eat, George found himself studying the faces they passed. Black and white, young and old, local residents and obvious outsiders like themselves. There was tension in those faces, but also something else. Determination, hope, the kind of quiet courage that his father had written about in his journals, the willingness to risk everything for the chance that tomorrow might be better than today. They found a small motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that catered to traveling salesmen and families on vacation, with clean rooms and reasonable rates. The desk clerk, a middle-aged white man with suspicious eyes, asked no questions about their business in Selma, but George could feel his assessment, his attempt to categorize them as tourists or troublemakers. "You all here for the march?" he asked as George signed the register. "We're here to see what's happening," George replied carefully. "Well, you picked an interesting time to visit. Town's been crawling with reporters and civil rights workers all week. Lot of outside agitators stirring up trouble." Margaret stepped forward with the diplomatic skills she'd perfected through 17 years of navigating small-town social situations. "We're just interested in seeing this historic place. My husband's father was involved in labor organizing back in the 30s, and we wanted to understand how those struggles connect to what's happening today." It was exactly the right thing to say, acknowledging their interest without revealing the full extent of their involvement, establishing their credentials as people with legitimate reasons to be there. The desk clerk's expression softened slightly. "Well, just be careful out there. Emotions are running pretty high on both sides." That evening, the Whitmans walked the streets of Selma like pilgrims visiting a sacred site. They passed Brown Chapel, where the march would begin the next morning, its red brick facade glowing in the setting sun. Groups of people, mostly young, mostly black, but with a significant number of white clergymen and college students, gathered on the steps and in the surrounding park, their conversations a mixture of strategy and prayer. George approached a group of ministers, their clerical collars marking them as clearly as uniforms, who were discussing the logistics of the next day's march. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the tentative politeness of someone venturing into unfamiliar territory. "My family and I came down from Ohio. We'd like to participate tomorrow if that's possible." One of the ministers, a tall black man with graying hair and kind eyes, studied George's face with the careful attention of someone accustomed to evaluating the sincerity of white allies. "What brings you down from Ohio, brother?" George struggled for words that could explain the journey they'd taken, not just the 800 miles in the Impala, but the emotional and moral distance they'd traveled from their comfortable suburban life to this moment on the streets of Selma. "My son," he said finally. "He's been trying to teach me about justice, about what it means to be an American. I thought it was time I started listening." The minister's smile transformed his entire face. "Then you're in the right place, brother. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., we gather at the chapel for prayer and instruction. Wear comfortable shoes. We've got a long walk ahead of us." That night, in their motel room with its faded floral wallpaper and window unit air conditioner, the Whitmans prepared for what they knew would be the most important day of their lives. Margaret packed a small bag with water, sandwiches, and first aid supplies. Brian read passages from his grandfather's journals, searching for wisdom and courage in Patrick Whitman's words about solidarity and sacrifice. George sat by the window looking out at the lights of Selma and thinking about the choices that had brought them to this place. "Are we doing the right thing?" Margaret asked, her voice small in the darkness. George thought about Tom Morrison's warnings, about the threats at work, about the comfortable life they were risking for people they didn't know, causes that didn't directly affect them. "I don't know if we're doing the right thing," he said finally, "but I know we're doing the necessary thing." Sunday morning dawned clear and warm, with the kind of perfect spring weather that seemed designed for momentous occasions. The Whitmans dressed carefully, comfortable shoes, as the minister had advised, but also their best clothes as if they were going to church rather than to a protest that could turn violent without warning. At Brown Chapel, they found themselves part of a gathering unlike anything they'd ever experienced. 800 people, ministers in clerical collars, college students in dungarees, families with small children, elderly men and women who had lived through decades of segregation and were finally ready to say, enough. The crowd was integrated in a way that was illegal in most of the South, natural in a way that made the laws against it seem not just wrong, but absurd. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood at the front of the chapel, his presence filling the space with an almost physical weight of moral authority. George had seen him on television, of course, had heard his speeches on the radio, but being in the same room with him was different. There was something in his bearing, dignity mixed with humility, strength tempered by gentleness, that made even his critics acknowledge his power. "Today, Doctor," King said, his voice carrying easily through the packed chapel, "we march not as Black Americans or white Americans, but as Americans. We march not in anger, but in love. We march not to defeat our enemies, but to awaken their consciences." The service that followed was part prayer meeting, part strategy session, part revival. They sang hymns that George recognized from his own church, "Amazing Grace, We Shall Overcome," but the familiar words carried new meaning in this context, surrounded by people who were literally willing to risk their lives for the chance to vote. As they prepared to leave the chapel, Dr. King approached the section where the Whitmans sat. "I understand we have visitors from Ohio," he said, his eyes finding George's face in the crowd. "Welcome, brother. Thank you for making the journey." George stood, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't name. "Thank you for letting us be part of this." "This is your march too," Dr. King replied. "This is America's march." They left Brown Chapel at 9 a.m., 800 people walking 2 by 2 down Sylvan Street toward the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The Whitmans found themselves near the middle of the column, between a group of ministers from Chicago and a family from Mississippi, whose patriarch was a 70-year-old man who had never been allowed to vote, but was determined to march for his grandchildren's future. The streets of Selma were lined with spectators, some supportive, others hostile, most simply curious about the spectacle of hundreds of people walking purposefully through their town. Police officers watched from strategic positions, their presence a reminder of what had happened 6 days earlier, but also a promise that today would be different. As they approached the bridge, George felt his heart rate increase. This was the place where peaceful protesters had been beaten unconscious, where tear gas had turned the bright Alabama sunshine into a choking haze, where the dream of American equality had almost died under the clubs of state troopers. But today, as they reached the crest of the bridge and looked down the highway toward Montgomery, they saw not a line of hostile troopers, but an escort of federal marshals and FBI agents, their presence ensuring safe passage for the marchers. "We're actually going to do it," Brian whispered, his voice filled with wonder and disbelief. "We're going to walk to Montgomery." The march that followed was unlike anything George had ever experienced. For 5 days they walked the highways of Alabama, sleeping in fields and churches, eating donated food prepared by supporters along the route, sharing stories and songs and dreams with people from every corner of American society. George found himself walking beside a professor from Harvard and a sharecropper from Mississippi, a nun from Detroit and a rabbi from New York. The artificial barriers that divided American society, race, class, education, geography, dissolved in the shared purpose of putting one foot in front of the other toward Montgomery. Margaret marched with a group of women who had traveled from churches across the South, their conversations ranging from child-rearing to theology, to the practical challenges of organizing a movement that challenged everything their society had told them was natural and necessary. For the first time in years, she found herself thinking thoughts that hadn't been filtered through the expectations of suburban respectability. Brian attached himself to a group of college students who treated him as an equal despite his age, sharing their passion for justice and their certainty that their generation would succeed where previous generations had failed. He carried his grandfather's journals in his backpack, reading passages aloud to anyone who would listen, connecting Patrick Whitman's struggles in the steel mills of Ohio to their march on the highways of Alabama. On the second night, camped in a field outside Lounsboro, George found himself sitting by a small campfire with Dr. King and several other march leaders. The conversation was quiet, reflective, a chance for these men who carried the weight of history to share their doubts and hopes in the darkness. "What made you come down here, George?" Dr. King asked, using the easy familiarity that had developed among the marchers. What made a factory worker from Ohio decide to walk to Montgomery? George stared into the fire, thinking about all the moments that had led to this one. The newspaper photograph of the unconscious woman on the bridge, Brian's passionate arguments at the dinner table, his father's journals in the attic, the confrontation with Tom Morrison on the church steps. "My son," he said finally, "he's been trying to teach me that neutrality isn't an option anymore, that good people have to choose sides." Dr. King nodded. "The children shall lead them." Isaiah knew what he was talking about, but it's not just Brian, it's my father too. He died when I was 12, but he left behind journals about organizing workers in the 30s. Reading them, I realized that every generation faces the same choice, comfort or conscience. I chose comfort for too long. And now? George looked around the circle at these men who had risked everything, their careers, their families, their lives, for the chance that America might finally live up to its promises. Now I'm learning that conscience is more comfortable than I thought. Hard, but comfortable. They reached Montgomery on March 25th, 25,000 strong, after picking up supporters along the route. The site of the Alabama State Capitol building, where Jefferson Davis had been sworn in as President of the Confederacy, now surrounded by Americans demanding their constitutional rights, was a moment of historical poetry that none of them would ever forget. Dr. King spoke from the steps of the Capitol, his voice carrying across the crowd and into history. How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long, because you shall reap what you sow. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. George stood with his arm around Margaret's shoulders and his hand on Brian's back, feeling the weight of the moment, the sense that they were witnessing something that would echo through American history. Around them, people wept openly, from exhaustion, from relief, from the simple joy of having completed something they'd started against overwhelming odds. But as the crowd began to disperse and the reality of returning to their normal lives set in, George felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. They had walked to Montgomery, had been part of history, had stood up for justice in the most public way imaginable. Now they had to go home to Millfield, Ohio, and live with the consequences. The drive back to Ohio was quieter than their journey south. They were exhausted, emotionally and physically drained by 5 days of walking and sleeping outdoors, and constant tension about what might happen next. But there was also something else, a sense of completion, of having finally answered the questions that had been troubling them for weeks. They stopped for gas in Tennessee, at the same station where they'd felt so unwelcome just a week earlier. This time the attendant was different, a young man who looked at their Alabama license plates, they'd picked up several during the march, and smiled. "Y'all were at the march, weren't you?" he said as he cleaned their windshield. "I seen it on the television, looked like something else." "It was," George said simply. "I wish I could have been there. My daddy says it's none of our business what happens in Alabama, but I don't know. Seems to me when Americans can't vote, it's everybody's business." As they continued north, the radio brought news of the world they'd left behind. President Johnson announcing his intention to send voting rights legislation to Congress, editorials in major newspapers praising the courage of the marchers, reports of sympathy demonstrations in cities across the country. But there was other news too. Violence against civil rights workers in Mississippi, resistance to integration in northern cities, the growing opposition to the war in Vietnam. The march to Montgomery had been a victory, but it was just one battle in a much larger war for America's soul. "What happens when we get home?" Margaret asked as they crossed the Ohio River. It was the question they'd all been avoiding. George's job was almost certainly gone. No one took a week of sick leave to participate in civil rights demonstrations and expected to return to work without consequences. Brian would face questions at school, possibly suspension for his unauthorized absence. Margaret would have to navigate the social minefield of Millfield society, where their neighbors had undoubtedly heard about their trip south. "I don't know," George admitted, "but we'll figure it out." Elm Street looked exactly the same as they'd left it. Neat lawns, modest houses, the comfortable predictability of suburban Ohio in March. But as they pulled into their driveway, George noticed subtle changes. Tom Morrison's house had its curtains drawn tight. The American flag that usually flew from the Petersons' porch was missing. Mrs. Henderson from across the street was watching from her window, but didn't wave. Word of their participation in the Selma March had preceded them home. Inside their house, everything was exactly as they'd left it, the breakfast dishes still in the sink, the newspaper folded on the kitchen table, the normal artifacts of their interrupted routine. But somehow it all felt different, smaller, as if they'd outgrown their old life during their 5 days in Alabama. The phone was ringing as they carried their suitcases inside. Margaret answered with the careful politeness she'd perfected over 17 years of marriage. Whitman residence. Yes, he's here. I'll tell him. She hung up and turned to George. That was Mr. Patterson from the plant. He wants to see you in his office first thing Monday morning. George nodded, not surprised, but still feeling the weight of what was coming. He'd known this moment would arrive, the reckoning with the comfortable life he'd risked for his principles. That evening, their first night back in their own beds, Margaret lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of Elm Street settling into sleep. But underneath the normalcy, she could sense the change in their community, the subtle shift that had occurred while they were away. "Are you sorry we went?" she whispered into the darkness. George was quiet for so long that she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then he spoke, his voice carrying a certainty she hadn't heard since they'd first met 20 years ago. "No. For the first time in my adult life, I'm not sorry about anything." Monday morning arrived grey and cold, Ohio asserting its seasonal authority after the warmth of Alabama. George dressed for work as he had for 17 years, blue work shirt, dark pants, steel-toed boots. But this time he carried himself differently. The man who'd walked from Selma to Montgomery couldn't quite fit back into the shape of the factory worker who'd never questioned his place in the world. At the GM plant, the change was immediate and obvious. Conversation stopped when he entered the break room. Men who'd shared lunch with him for years found reasons to sit at other tables. The easy camaraderie of the assembly line was replaced by a careful distance that felt more dangerous than outright hostility. Tom Morrison worked his station 2 positions down, installing rear-view mirrors with the mechanical precision of someone determined to ignore his former friend's presence. When their eyes met during the morning break, Tom's expression was a mixture of disappointment, anger, and something that might have been pity. At 10 a.m. the summons came. A secretary from the front office appeared on the factory floor, an unusual sight that drew attention from every worker within earshot. "Mr. Whitman, Mr. Patterson wants to see you in his office." The walk from the assembly line to the administrative offices felt longer than the 54 miles from Selma to Montgomery. George passed through the plant where he'd worked for 17 years, seeing it with new eyes. The way the black workers were concentrated in the worst jobs, the subtle segregation that existed even in supposedly integrated northern factories, the system of privilege and exclusion that he'd never noticed when he was safely inside it. Patterson's office was exactly what George expected. Wood paneling, company awards, photographs of management retreats where middle-aged white men celebrated their success in comfortable anonymity. Patterson sat behind his desk like a judge preparing to render sentence. "Sit down, George." George remained standing. "I'd rather hear what you have to say on my feet." Patterson's jaw tightened. "Fine. I'll make this simple. Your employment with General Motors is terminated, effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks severance pay and your accumulated vacation time. Your benefits will continue through the end of the month. On what grounds? Excessive absenteeism. Conduct detrimental to company interests. Take your pick." Patterson leaned back in his chair, his expression coldly professional. "Did you really think you could participate in communist-inspired demonstrations and keep your job?" Communist-inspired? George felt anger rising in his chest. Not the hot, impulsive anger of youth, but the cold, steady anger of a man who'd finally learned to recognize injustice. Those were American citizens exercising their constitutional rights. Those were outside agitators trying to destroy the social order that's made this country great. And you were fool enough to let them use you. George looked around the office one last time, at the company slogans on the walls, the production charts, the symbols of a system that had rewarded his compliance for 17 years and was now punishing his conscience. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but at least I was used for something worthwhile." He cleaned out his locker without ceremony, packing 17 years of accumulated possessions into a cardboard box. Work gloves, safety goggles, a spare shirt, the photograph of Margaret and Brian he'd kept taped to his locker door. His co-workers watched the ritual with the careful attention of people witnessing an execution, understanding that George's fate could be theirs if they stepped out of line. Frank Kowalski was the only one who spoke. Where will you go, George? I don't know yet, but I'll figure something out. Take care of yourself, friend, and take care of your family. As George walked out of the GM plant for the last time, carrying his cardboard box of belongings, he felt not the despair he'd expected, but a strange sense of liberation. The job that had defined him for 17 years, that had provided security and status and a place in the community, was gone. But somehow he felt more like himself than he had in decades. The news of George's firing spread through Millfield with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. By evening, everyone on Elm Street knew that the Whitman family had participated in the Selma March and that George had lost his job as a result. The responses varied. Some neighbors crossed the street to avoid having to speak to them. Others made a point of offering quiet words of support. Mrs. Peterson knocked on their door Tuesday evening with a casserole and a carefully worded message. "I wanted you to know that not everyone in this town thinks you did wrong," she said, her voice low as if she were sharing state secrets. "What happened to those people on that bridge? Well, it wasn't Christian, no matter what some folks are saying." Margaret accepted the casserole with gratitude that went beyond mere politeness. In the small gestures of support, she found confirmation that their sacrifice hadn't been meaningless, that some seeds of change were taking root, even in the conservative soil of Millfield, Ohio. Brian returned to school to face a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and hostility. Some students treated him like a celebrity, wanting to hear stories about meeting Dr. King and walking with history. Others, reflecting their parents' views, saw him as a traitor to his race and community. But most were simply confused, trying to understand why a family from their own neighborhood would risk everything for people they'd never met. "What was it like?" his friend Tommy Peterson asked during lunch. "Meeting Dr. King, I mean." Brian thought about how to explain the experience of being in the presence of someone who seemed to embody the best possibilities of American ideals. "Like meeting someone who actually believed in the Constitution," he said finally. "Not just the parts that were convenient, but all of it." That evening, the Whitman family held another of their kitchen table conferences, this time focused on the practical question of survival. With George's income gone, they had perhaps 3 months before their savings ran out. The house payment, insurance, utilities, groceries, all the expenses that had seemed manageable on a factory worker's salary now loomed like mountains. "I could go back to work," Margaret offered. She'd been a secretary before Brian was born, had skills that might still be valuable in Millfield's small business community. "Maybe," George said, "but first, let me see what else is out there." He spent the next week driving to factories within 50 miles of Millfield, filling out applications, sitting through interviews where his employment history raised questions he couldn't answer without revealing why he'd been fired. Word of his participation in Selma had spread through Ohio's industrial network with remarkable efficiency. Plant managers talked to each other, and troublemakers were noted and avoided. It was Frank Kowalski who provided the breakthrough. On Friday evening, he stopped by the Whitman house with news. "There's a job opening at the Ford plant in Columbus," he said, settling into the kitchen chair that had become reserved for serious conversations. "My cousin works there, says they need experienced line workers. It's union shop, good benefits, about the same pay as GM." "What's the catch?" Frank smiled. "No catch, but it's in Columbus, 60 miles from here. You'd have to move, start over somewhere else." George looked around their kitchen, at the table where they'd eaten thousands of meals, at the window where Margaret had watched Brian grow from a toddler to a young man, at the accumulated evidence of 17 years of building a life in Millfield. "What do you think?" he asked Margaret. She was quiet for a moment, considering all the implications. Leaving Millfield meant leaving behind not just their house and neighborhood, but their identity as small-town people, their place in a community that had defined them since the day they were married. But it also meant freedom from the judgment and hostility that now shadowed their daily lives. It meant a chance to start over in a place where their participation in Selma might be seen as courage rather than betrayal. "I think," she said finally, "that maybe it's time for a new beginning." They put the house on Elm Street up for sale in April, just as the dogwood trees were beginning to bloom and the lawns were turning green with spring's promise. The real estate agent, a carefully diplomatic woman who'd sold homes in Millfield for 20 years, warned them that their association with the civil rights movement might affect the property's marketability. "Some folks might be reluctant to buy from you," she said delicately. Not because of anything wrong with the house, you understand. Just because of recent events. But to everyone's surprise, the house sold within 2 weeks to a young couple from Dayton who saw it as their first step toward the American dream. They walked through the rooms with the same wide-eyed appreciation George and Margaret had felt 20 years earlier, seeing not the site of political controversy, but a well-maintained home in a quiet neighborhood where they could raise their children. The closing was scheduled for May 15th, giving the Whitmans a month to pack their belongings and prepare for their move to Columbus. It was a strange month, filled with the routine tasks of ending one life and beginning another, boxing books and dishes, arranging utility transfers, saying goodbye to neighbors who'd shared their street for 17 years. Some of those goodbyes were easier than others. Mrs. Peterson cried openly as they loaded their belongings into a rented truck, extracting promises that they'd stay in touch, that they'd come back to visit, that this departure wasn't really an ending. Tom Morrison watched from his front porch as they packed, his expression unreadable. For 17 years, the two men had been friends, not close friends perhaps, but the kind of steady, reliable neighbors who'd helped each other with home repairs and shared beers on summer evenings. Now they faced each other across a divide that seemed unbridgeable. Finally, as George was loading the last boxes into the truck, Tom crossed the street. "I still think you're making a mistake," he said without preamble. "I know you do. These civil rights people, they don't care about you, George. They used you to make their point, and now you're the one paying the price." George straightened, his back aching from the morning's work. "Maybe. But at least I was used for something I believe in." Tom was quiet for a moment, studying his former friend's face. "What if you're wrong? What if all this trouble, all this upheaval doesn't change anything? Then at least I'll know I tried to change it." They shook hands, awkwardly, formally, like strangers meeting for the first time. Then Tom returned to his porch and George climbed into the truck beside Margaret and Brian, and the Whitman family drove away from Elm Street for the last time. Columbus in 1965 was a city in transition, large enough to offer anonymity, small enough to feel manageable, progressive enough to welcome families whose politics might have made them unwelcome in smaller communities. The Whitmans found a modest apartment on the north side, close to the Ford plant where George would work and the high school where Brian would finish his junior year. It wasn't Millfield. The neighborhoods were more diverse, the pace of life faster, the social networks less predictable. But there was freedom in that diversity, liberation in being judged on their present actions rather than their past associations. George started work at the Ford plant on a Monday morning in June, walking into a factory that looked remarkably similar to the GM plant he'd left behind. But the atmosphere was different, more integrated, more politically aware, populated by workers who'd seen the Selma marches on television and understood that what had happened in Alabama was connected to their own struggles for dignity and fair treatment. "Heard you were at Selma," said the man working the station next to George's on his first day. "That must have been something." "It was," George replied, and realized that for the first time in months he didn't have to qualify or apologize for his answer. Brian finished his junior year at his new high school with grades good enough to earn consideration at several colleges. His application essays, when he wrote them the following fall, focused on the lessons he'd learned about moral courage and civic responsibility, about the connections between his grandfather's struggles in the 1930s and the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Margaret found work as a secretary at a downtown law firm, where her efficiency and discretion were valued more highly than her political associations. For the first time in her adult life, she was earning her own money, contributing directly to her family's welfare in ways that went beyond domestic management. On summer evenings, they would sit on the small balcony of their apartment, watching the city come alive with the energy of a community that was learning to see itself as part of something larger than its own immediate concerns. Columbus in 1965 was hosting civil rights meetings, anti-war protests and cultural events that brought together people from different backgrounds and perspectives. "Do you miss Millfield?" Margaret asked one evening as they watched the sun set over the city skyline. George considered the question honestly. He missed the predictability of small-town life, the way everyone had known their place and role. He missed the security of never having to question his choices or defend his principles. But he didn't miss the person he'd been there, The man who'd kept his head down and his opinions to himself, who'd chosen comfort over conscience for so many years that he'd almost forgotten he had a conscience at all. "Sometimes," he said, "but not enough to go back." 1 year later, March 9th, 1966, George Whitman woke to the familiar sound of an alarm clock, though this one sat on a different nightstand in a different bedroom in a different city. The routine was similar but not identical: shower, coffee, newspaper, work. But the man performing these rituals had been fundamentally changed by everything that had happened in the intervening months. The newspaper, the Columbus Dispatch instead of the Millfield Daily Herald, carried stories about the continuing civil rights struggle, about voting rights legislation working its way through Congress, about young men being drafted for a war in Vietnam that was growing more controversial by the day. George read all of it now, not just the sports section, understanding that what happened in distant places was connected to his own life in ways he'd spent years trying to ignore. Margaret made breakfast, eggs and bacon and toast, the same meal she'd prepared thousands of times before. But now she was dressed for her own workday, her own contribution to their family's welfare. She was no longer just George's wife and Brian's mother. She was a working woman with her own opinions and her own stake in the world beyond their home. Brian, now 17 and preparing for his senior year, had grown into the kind of young man Patrick Whitman would have recognized and admired. He wore his grandfather's Union pin on his jacket, carried his journals to school, and spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned that moral courage was not a luxury, but a necessity. "What's the plan for today?" Margaret asked as they finished breakfast. "Work," George said. "Same as always, but after work there's a meeting at the church about housing discrimination. Thought we might go." A year earlier, George Whitman would never have attended a meeting about housing discrimination. It would have seemed like someone else's problem, someone else's responsibility. But the man who'd walked from Selma to Montgomery understood that discrimination anywhere was a threat to justice everywhere. As they prepared to leave for their respective destinations, George to the Ford plant, Margaret to her law firm, Brian to school, the radio played the morning news. Among the stories was a brief report about continued voter registration efforts in Alabama, about the slow but steady progress being made in communities where people had once been beaten for attempting to exercise their constitutional rights. "Listen to that," Brian said, pausing with his backpack half-zipped. "They registered 1,500 new voters in Selma last month, 1,500 people who couldn't vote a year ago." George felt a familiar warmth in his chest. Not pride exactly, but satisfaction. The kind of satisfaction that came from knowing you'd been part of something larger than yourself, something that would outlast your own life and contribute to a better world for your children. Outside their Columbus apartment, the city was waking up to a new day. It wasn't the predictable, comfortable awakening of Millfield, Ohio, but something more complex and challenging. More diverse, more conflicted, more alive with possibility. The Westclock's alarm clock on their nightstand would ring again tomorrow morning, and George would wake to another day of routine rituals and ordinary responsibilities. But he would never again be the man who read only the sports section, who avoided difficult conversations, who believed that staying neutral was the same as staying innocent. He was, finally, the son Patrick Whitman had hoped to raise, a man who understood that justice delayed was justice denied, that silence in the face of injustice made you complicit in that injustice, that the ultimate measure of a man was not where he stood in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stood at times of challenge and controversy. The morning coffee tasted better than it ever had in Millfield, not because it was different coffee, but because it was being drunk by a different man, one who'd learned that the most important revolutions didn't happen on bridges in Alabama or in the halls of Congress, but in the hearts and minds of ordinary people who decided one morning at a time what kind of Americans they wanted to be. As George walked to his car for the drive to work, he could hear the radio playing in Mrs. Johnson's apartment next door. Not pop music or farm reports, but a call-in show where people discussed the issues of the day. Voices raised in disagreement, sometimes in anger, but always in engagement. The sound of a democracy working, messily and imperfectly, but working nonetheless. He paused for a moment before getting into his car, listening to those voices and thinking about the journey that had brought him from the comfortable silence of Elm Street to the challenging complexity of his new life. It had cost him his job, his house, his place in the only community he'd ever known, But it had given him something more valuable than security or comfort or social acceptance. It had given him the chance to look his son in the eye without shame, to honor his father's memory with more than just inherited photographs, to wake up each morning knowing that he was living a life worthy of the principles he claimed to believe in. The sun was rising over Columbus, Ohio, painting the sky in shades of promise and possibility. George Whitman got into his car, turned the key, and drove toward whatever challenges and opportunities the day might bring, secure in the knowledge that he was finally, completely, authentically himself. And somewhere in Alabama, in small towns and big cities across the South and North, other ordinary people were making their own choices about what kind of Americans they wanted to be. The morning after Selma had become every morning after, every chance to choose conscience over comfort, courage over compliance, action over apathy. The revolution Patrick Whitman had dreamed of, the justice Brian had demanded, the America Margaret had hoped for. It was happening one person at a time, one family at a time, one morning at a time, as ordinary people decided that neutrality was no longer an option and that the time for silence had finally, irrevocably passed.